Good evening and welcome to the Massachusetts Historical Society's 5th Movie Club. Even though we've been hosting movie clubs for 5 months, it's worth mentioning that the idea for the movie club is basically like a book club. We'll pick a movie every month, people watch it on their own, and then we get together to have a discussion. However, unlike your average book club, we are going to supply experts to help us understand and verify the stories in the movies. This evening, we'll discuss the 1973 film, The Friends of Eddie Coyle.
This is Eddie Coyle.
This is a favorite of mine. And we'll be joined by film critic Ty Burr, who will help guide our discussion and answer questions.
And these are his friends.
The Massachusetts Historical Society hosts a variety of programs, seminars, and teacher workshops throughout the course of the year. We offer many of these programs for free or for very modest costs, but we're only able to do this thanks to the support of our members and donors. If you enjoy being a part of our movie club, we hope you'll also consider becoming a member of MHS to support our work. Now, to begin our conversation, we are joined by Ty Burr. He writes a film and popular culture newsletter, Ty Burr's Watch List, on Substack, and was the Boston Globe's film critic and cultural columnist for almost 20 years. Prior to that, he wrote for Entertainment Weekly and programmed movies for HBO. He is the author of a number of books, including Gods Like Us, Movie Stardom and Modern Fame, and the 50 Movie Starter Kit where you need to know if you want to know what you're talking about. He is a member of the National Society of Film Critics and the Boston Society of Film Critics, and in 2017 he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Criticism. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ty, who I think is going to be our expert for this evening.
Thank you, Gavin. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on here. Welcome, folks. Thanks for coming here on a Tuesday night, a lovely Tuesday night out there. And hope we can have a good time talking about this movie, this wonderful, influential movie. I'm trying to forget the news that I just heard coming over the news about yet another school shooting. And I don't bring it up just randomly. It seems to me that this is a country in which crime is a narrative, an ongoing narrative. And I think George V. Higgins understood that and wrote to that. And the 2 movies made from his works, The Friends of Eddie Coyle and a 2009 movie called Killing Them Softly from his 3rd book, Cogan's Trade, even more so ties in low-level crime to a certain American way. And I think in Friends of Eddie Coyle, crime is almost seen to be a Boston way of being for a certain subculture and subsection. Let's talk about the movie. I'm assuming everybody here has seen the movie. I hope you've seen the movie. It was hard to see for quite a while. It was out on videotape, but people didn't really talk about it. When it came out in 1973, it received good reviews, not rave reviews, but Roger Ebert liked it. Vincent Canby for the New York Times liked it, and it made not very much money at all. In fact, if I'm looking at the top moneymakers, top grossing movies of 1973, it made less money than The Exorcist and The Sting and American Graffiti. It also made less money than the film version of Jonathan Livingston's Seagull, which came in at number 24. Friends of Eddie Coyle did not break the top 30 in box office gross, which I think was a disappointment for the people who made it because they knew they'd made a good movie. And in fact, Peter Yates, the director, the director who made Bullet and a lot of other very, very fine films, Breaking Away, he cited this as his favorite movie of all the movies he made. It did not make, so it was available on videotape, but it really did not come back into the cultural discussion until 2009 when Criterion DVD released it as a DVD, and it's available on the Criterion channel and other places. And at that point, with a sort of very lush coffee table version with liner notes and a really nice print, people started talking about it again, although it had never entirely left the conversation once Boston crime movies came into vogue in the late 1990s. And so just to circle around to that, Friends of Eddie Coyle was not a hit movie when it came out, but it was influential in very, very important ways, both as a novel, and I'll talk about George V. Higgins in a second, and as a film. People who saw this movie liked it, wanted to write like it, wanted to make more movies like it. It made an impression for a variety of reasons. The movie invented the Boston crime movie as we understand it today, in the same way that the Higgins novel invented the Boston crime novel as a genre. But it took 20 years, almost 20 years, for it to be picked up on and become a Hollywood money-making genre. And the reason for that is that Higgins' greatest acolyte, arguably Dennis Lehane, had a number of best-selling books, including Mystic River and Gone Baby Gone, that were very attractive to Hollywood and made into big movies by Clint Eastwood and Ben Affleck. And the ground had already been sowed, I would argue, by Good Will Hunting, which created the idea of a Boston movie, and really introduced South Boston as a narrative space for the rest of the country to understand, in a way that I don't think I even have to argue became a cliche over the next 15 years of Boston crime movies. So by the time you get to 2016, I don't know how many of you have seen the Seth Meyers fake movie trailer for a movie called Boston Accent that was on his late night show in 2016. You should look it up. It's on YouTube. It's called Boston Accent. It is just relentless skewering of all the cliches of The Departed, and God Baby Gone, and The Town, and all of these movies. But I would argue that that genre would not exist as a literary genre and as a film genre without the Friends of Eddie Coyle. And the movie had to just do a slow burn. For one thing, the influence of the novel on writers was immense. Elmore Leonard called Friends of Eddie Coyle the best crime novel he'd ever read. And in fact, when he wrote his novel Rum Punch, Elmore Leonard, he named the character Jackie Burke as a sort of sideways tribute to Jackie Brown, who's one of the main characters in Friends of Eddie Coyle. And if the name Jackie Brown rings a bell, well, that's because Quentin Tarantino loved the Higgins novel and the Yates movie so much that he created his own. When he made his own version of Rum Punch, he changed the name back to Jackie Brown, and that's what he named the title of the film. So you've got these genetic roots running all the way back to George V. Higgins and the film. And certainly the film Friends of Eddie Coyle is a key film in the mindscape of Quentin Tarantino and a lot of people who followed him. So this movie's bloodline is all over American films. So let's talk a little bit about George V. Higgins. If you have not read any of his work, I really urge you to do so, especially his first three, which are a kind of loose trilogy. Friends of Eddie Coyle, which was his debut. It's kind of funny to call it a debut because he had tried to publish 15 novels before. He had 15 novels, debut novels, before he actually sold one. So he said, it's an overnight success that took 20 years. The second one is The Digger's Game. And the third one is Cogan's Trade, which is the one that was made into the Brad Pitt movie, Killing Them Softly. It's a terrific read. After Friends of Eddie Coyle was a bestseller, and it really launched his career. And he wrote 32 books, most of them fiction, not all of them crime, but all of them Boston-centered, almost all of them Boston-centered. Some of them about politicians, some of them about prosecutors, some of them about a handful about a policeman. And this is a world he knew. He was a Boston kid. Higgins he's born in Brockton. He went to Boston College, went out west for some master's work, that came back very quickly, went to BC Law, and briefly was in Providence covering mob trials for the Associated Press. So he's a journalist, and he got his law degree, and he was a prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office. He actually went down to DC for a couple of years and had private law practice, where he represented people like G. Gordon Liddy and Eldridge Cleaver. This guy knew a lot of characters, and he listened to how they spoke. And he loved how they spoke. And if you read any of his works, I think a newcomer coming to Higgins is baffled at first because the books are 90% dialogue. The prose is just pared down to the absolute bone. And you have to kind of fight your way in to figure out who's talking. What are they talking about? They're talking about a heist. And they're talking about this guy over there. And the reader has to become involved and sort of piece together the action, as it were. And he came into some criticism for this. Some people found it off-putting. And Higgins felt like, why not let the characters tell the story in their own words? He actually said, and this is a quote, he said, the quotes make the story. Dialogue is character and character is plot. So the plot is these people talking. And when you get criminals talking, especially the criminals he liked to write about, it's all bravura. It's all colorful talk. It's all talk to get other people to do what they want them to. And it's extremely colorful. It's kind of arias of gangster speak. And it's often very funny, even if the characters are being deadly serious. Higgins loves the language. And when they made the film, when Peter Yates made the film, and they barely changed anything. And in fact, I'm going to read you a little section from the book, and then I'm going to show you a scene from the film, and you can see how close it is. I mean, in a sense, Higgins basically wrote a screenplay, and every time every time they tried to come up with additional dialogue, it didn't work. It felt forced. But every time they went back to the book, it worked beautifully. So here's a scene where Eddie Coyle, if you haven't seen the movie, well, shame on you, what are you doing here? If you haven't seen the movie, Eddie Coyle is a low-level hood who's kind of a failure, and he was running guns for a bunch of, quote, friends. The title is ironic. Nobody's friends with anybody else here. They're all out to screw each other over. But he has a bunch of friends who are doing bank robberies in the greater Boston area. And his job is to get illegal guns for each of their heists. And so his contact in getting guns is a young guy named Jackie Brown. And he's putting in a rush order. And Jackie Brown is like resisting because it takes time for him to get his guns together. And so here's a passage from the book. Now look, Jackie Brown said. Now look, nothing, the stocky man said. That's Eddie Coyle. I'm getting old. I spent my whole life sitting around in one crummy joint after another with a bunch of punks like you, drinking coffee, eating hash, and watching other people take off for Florida while I got to sweat how the hell I'm going to pay the plumber next week. I've done time and I stood up, but I can't take no more chances. You can give me a whole ration of shit and this and that, and blah, blah, blah. But you're still a kid and you're going out and coming around and saying, well, I'm a man. You can take what I say and it'll happen. I go through. Well, you're learning something too, kid. And I advise you, you better learn it now. Because when you say that, when you get me out there all alone on what you say, well, you better be back there and back me. Because once you say it's going to happen, it's going to fucking happen. And if it doesn't, you got your cock cut in a zipper, but good. Now, I don't want no talk and shit from you. I want 10 guns from you, and I got the money to pay for them. And I want them tomorrow afternoon at the place where we were before. And I'm going to be there, and you're going to be there with those goddamn guns. Because if you're not, I'm going to come looking for you, and I'll find you too, because I'm not going to be the only one that's looking for you. And we know how to find people. And if you follow the book so far, you know that that's the toughest that Eddie Coyle is ever going to get. He's actually somebody who's not all that tough, but he knows with this guy he can pull back. Here is that scene from the film. And it is set, one of the glories of the film is that they shot it in Boston. Of course, they had to shoot it in Boston. And they shot it. It is, you mentioned you're going to be showing the Thomas Crown Affair. That is the tourist version of Boston. I've written about the filming of that movie, and they literally hooked up with the Boston Chamber of Commerce, and they said, okay, we're shooting a scene in the public gardens. We're shooting a scene, on the Esplanade. We're going here, we're going there. It is absolutely what an out-of-towner would think of Boston. The Friends of Eddie Coyle is not that film. It is all the places that the tourists do not go. The Boston Bowl, there's a tavern on the Kentucky Tavern on the corner of Newbury Street and Mass Ave. All the old Dedham mall, the old Dedham Mall out on Route 1 comes in for a scene. Anyway, here's the scene, takes place at the Boston Bowl.
You owe me 10 more guns. I need them fast. When do I get them?
Look, I got you the first batch when I said them. I was ahead on the dozen. You know, these things take time.
Time is what I haven't got. I'm getting pressure. I gotta see the man tomorrow night. I need those guns.
I can't get them for you by tomorrow night.
Son of a bitch, I gotta have that stuff fast. I got a long ride to make tomorrow night. I need the stuff with me when I make it.
No way, no day, no Kindle. I told you, I get quality. These things take time.
Tomorrow night.
You aren't buying a loaf of bread, you know. I got a thing set up that works pretty good. Dependable stuff that's not going to get anybody in trouble. I'm not going to screw it up just because you people got hot drawers. You'll have to tell them that.
You tell.
Look, the stuff will come. What's the big emergency?
Look, one of the first things I learned is never to ask a man why he's in a hurry. All you got to know is I told a man that he could depend on me because you told me I could depend on you. Now, one of us is going to have a big fat problem. Another thing I learned, if anybody's going to have a problem, you're going to be the one.
You finished?
No, I'm not finished. Look, I'm getting old. You hear? I spent most of my life hanging around crummy joints with a bunch of punks, drinking the beer, eating the hash and the hot dogs, and watching the other people go off to Florida while I'm sweating out. I'm going to pay the plumber. I done time when I stood up, but I can't take no more chances. Next time, it's going to be me going to Florida. You're still a kid. And you come out, you go around and say, look, I'm a man. You can take what I say, and it happens. I go through. Well, you're learning something too, my friend, and I advise you to learn it right now. You say that. When you get me out there all by myself on what you say, you better be right there and back of me. Because when you say it happens, it's going to fucking happen. If it don't, you got your thing caught in a zip. You know, just now, I don't want any talk from you and any shit from you. I want 10 guns. I want it tomorrow night. I'll be right there with the money, same place where we were before. I'll be there with the money. You be there with those goddamn guns. Because if you ain't, I'll be looking for you, and I'll find you too. Because I ain't the only one that's going to be looking for you, and we know how to find people.
I'll stop it there. Let me just allow that Robert Mitchum gives a much better performance of that monologue than I just did. But that is just an example of how the dialogue is lifted off the page and just put into the movie, and it works. Works beautifully. A word, by the way, Robert Mitchum's Boston accent is one of the better ones in the history of Boston accents in the movies. He wears it very lightly. It only comes out in certain words. It's not 100%, but you know, when you put him next to some of the putative Boston accents that have been in Boston crime movies or Boston movies set in Boston, it's up there, and I would say the top 20. There is a running. I'd love to hear from people what their opinion of the worst Boston accent in a Boston movie is. My personal choice is Rob Morrow in Quiz Show, but I know that everybody has their own, particular offender. Let's talk a little bit about Mitchum. Robert Mitchum was a god of film noir. He was at a fairly low point in his career at this point. He had taken a gamble on a David Lean film where he played a very out of character type, sort of shy school teacher in Ryan's Way. And it had Ryan's daughter, excuse me. And it had not really taken off the way he wanted to. I think he very much appreciated this film and the role. And I think he was disappointed that it didn't do better. But he came to Boston. He was a man at that point who liked his women and who liked his drink. And there are stories about him on the set, showing up maybe a little half in the bag and then going in and acing a scene. He wanted to hang out with real Boston gangsters. And he told George V. Higgins, I want to hang out with Whitey Bulger. who at that point in 1973 was considered a sort of eccentric Robin Hood of Somerville, was not known to be the murderous creep turncoat that we know him as now, the demon of Boston crime history. But Higgins knew, and Higgins said, "You do not want to be hanging out with Whitey Bulger, Bob. Don't do that." But he did. Mitchum did hang out with Stephen Winter, who was another sort of associate of Bulger's. He was introduced to him by Alex Rocco, who many of you know as Mo Green from The Godfather, but who also plays one of the bank robbers in the Friends of Eddie Coyle. And a little known thing about Alex Rocco, I didn't know this until I started researching this film, was that he was born in Cambridge, grew up in Somerville, and was basically Friends of Eddie Coyle, was running with the gangsters, knew Whitey Bulger, was questioned in a mob killing, did time for robbery. And when he got out of jail, he said the hell with this and moved to LA and became an actor. So this is somebody who was very deeply rooted in this world and knew everybody. And so he did introduce Mitchum to Stephen Winter, and I've got a picture here. Let me throw it up here. Howie Winter. This is from the evening they met. And there's Mitchum, and there's Howie Winter kissing Alex Rocco, and here are these good fellows here. And yeah, that's Robert Mitchum doing research for the Friends of Eddie Coyle. And when Higgins told him you don't want to be hanging out with Whitey Bulger, Mitchum was reportedly said, "Well, listen, he's the one that's going to be the one that's hanging out with a known criminal," because famously, Robert Mitchum, when in 1949 was busted for pot and went to jail. Actress Lila Leeds were caught in a police sting, and he spent a week in jail, in the county jail, which he said was just like Palm Springs, but without the riffraff. And then he served 43 days at the county prison farm, where the life photographers took photos of him mopping the floor. And when he came out, I'm going to show you a picture of Mitchum getting out of jail, just because this will give you an idea of how much this really affected his persona. I mean, it's 1949. Look at that man. For one thing, he's impeccably dressed. For another thing, he's like, hey, so what? I got busted for weed. What the hell? He was a bigger star than ever. His movies that came out after that were top box office hits. It's the kind of scandal that before World War II would have killed a career. The studio heads would have scuttled around and have it covered up. With Mitchum, this is what makes Mitchum different. He just doesn't care. I don't have time, but I urge you to go look at the trailer or the film for Out of the Past, his great film noir, probably his greatest film noir. Whereas, he has a love scene where the woman's just telling him how much she loves him, and he looks at her and goes, "Baby, I just don't care," and then reaches in and gives her a kiss. And there's been nobody like that in American film. He's the quintessential film noir anti-hero, and Out of the Past is absolutely wonderful. I really highly recommend you see it. But he brings that "baby, I just don't care" energy to a degree to Friends of Eddie Coyle. Problem with Eddie Coyle is that he does care. Eddie Coyle's been going up on a burglary rap up in New Hampshire, and the one thing that's springing the plot forward is that he's trying to bring a police detective some information, so the police detective will put in a good word with a judge, and he won't have to go to jail, 2 years in jail, and be away from his wife and kids. So he does care, and it's very interesting to watch Mitchum play somebody who is very anxious, but also working in a criminal milieu where you don't show your anxiety. And that scene that we just watched is a very good example of somebody who's being tough as nails and really cowing down a younger guy. But if you look carefully, you can see the anxiety and the desperation that's sort of propelling him forward. One last thing I want to say about this story, and then we can open it up to questions and talk about some other stuff, is that there is a theory that Eddie Coyle, the character, that Higgins based him on a Whitey Bulger associate named Billy O'Brien, William Billy O'Brien, who was involved in bank robberies and who in 1967 was killed in ways similar to the climax of Friends of Eddie Coyle. And actually, Howie Carr, the indefatigable Howie Carr, who has written much about and talked much about the Boston crime scene and Boston crime history, has always believed that the character of Dylan, the bartender played by Peter Boyle in the film, who is also telling things to the cops, Howie Carr thinks that that character is based on Whitey Bulger, who, as we do know now, but was not known then, was in fact involved with the feds and passing them information. But Higgins, Howie Carr apparently did ask George Higgins when Higgins was still alive about that, and Higgins said, "I wrote about Dylan before Whitey became Whitey, if you know what I mean." And it is true that the Whitey Bulger that people knew about back then, and he wasn't a household name by any means in 1973, was a very different figure than the one that's known, that played by Johnny Depp, in recent movies. Higgins also denied that he even knew about Billy O'Brien, which I doubt, given how knowledgeable he was about the Boston crime scene. But maybe he just didn't want to make that link. Maybe it would get him in touch with somebody. But there certainly is that possibility. Higgins, he wrote 32 books, like he wanted to get it all out before the axe came down, and he died at 59 of a heart attack very suddenly in 1999. I don't think, certainly he wasn't expecting that, and people were expecting more work from him. His acolytes are many. They include Dennis Lehane, who has acknowledged that he owes everything to Higgins. Elmore Leonard, as I mentioned, Robert B. Parker of the Spencer novels. Higgins basically helped, I won't say discovered him, but helped launch his career, got him to a publisher, wrote blurbs for his first books, really made his career happen. And of course, the movies that whole cycle of Boston crime movies that I think for now has petered out, but that I think will come in for another cycle at some point. And it may be richer and more complex. As with all cycles, they start fresh and then they sort of run themselves into ruts, and then they stop for a while and then they come back. It's like Westerns. The Boston crime movie is now a genre like the Western. That's, I would love to see more movies made from Higgins novels. Like I said, Killing Them Softly from Cogan's Trade. It's set in Louisiana, although they still use Boston place names, which is kind of nutty. They talk about some place called Haverhill, which clearly nobody who's ever, that would only be said by somebody who's never been to New England. But it is, it takes the structure of Higgins' novel and applies it to a larger American political themes in ways that sometimes don't work, but when they work, it's really interesting. And James Gandolfini is in it as a failed hitman in one of the more interesting roles of his career. And that's the kind of character that Higgins would write, a depressed hitman, a hitman so depressed he just can't do the work anymore. I would also recommend a book that I think it's 1981 called The Rat on Fire, which is literally about arsonists who want to burn down a Boston tenement to get the money, and their theory is that if they set rats on fire and put them in the walls, that'll start things. It doesn't work out the way they want. Higgins' novels are full of people with grandiose plans that always come to naught. And I think that there is a greater philosophy in that of just defeat that I think is quintessentially Boston. I wrote about this for my newsletter earlier today, went up today. And one of the things I said is that if Goodfellas is the great New York gangster film in that it celebrates swagger and arrogance and paranoia, Friends of Eddie Coyle is the great Boston crime movie because it says all of those things do not give you an edge, do not help you at the end of the day. It's all going to go to shit. And I don't know. I think there's something fundamentally, ruthlessly Boston in that. So that's my spiel. That's what I have to say. I would love to hear what you guys have to say. So let's open it up to questions. Gavin, how do we want to do this? Do you want me to just sort of take a look at who's got their hands up and what?
Well, it looks like Julie has raised her hand. So Julie, if you want to unmute, you can ask your question.
Great. Thank you so much to the MHS and to Mr. Burr for this event. I am obsessed with this movie. I watch it every 2 years, and I'm old, so I've watched it many times. But I read in a Mitchum biography that he was offered the role of Dylan. Yes. And after reading the screenplay and the book, he preferred to be cast as Eddie Coyle. Yes. The last time I watched the movie, I kind of imagined the two actors in the different roles, and I just couldn't get him across as Dylan. And you mentioned the level of anxiety that Mitchum conveys. Mm-hmm. So many other complex things going on in his head that you can really feel in it. I wonder if you could talk about the casting and how wise he was to take Eddie Coyle.
I haven't read the Mitchum biography, but I do know that that's true, that he was approached to play Dylan, the character that Peter Boyle ultimately played. Do you happen to know if in the biography if they mentioned who they wanted initially to play Eddie Coyle before Mitchum took the part?
Oh, I can't remember, but I'll go get the book and I'll put it in the chat.
I'm very curious.
This book. Yeah.
Because I can't imagine, obviously they would want a star because that's how you get, that's how you get movies bankrolled. And it makes me wonder who they would have wanted to have Eddie Coyle to play Eddie Coyle. Maybe somebody younger, maybe somebody, maybe Mitchum was at that point was seen to, although the character in the book is in his 40s, and Mitchum makes a point of saying in that monologue that he's in his 50s. So he was older. And I think it would have been a very cool character role for Mitchum if he had played Dylan. But I also think that he was a very savvy man about his career. And just saw this as what it is. It's a modern day noir, and saw his place in it, and also saw a character that I think at this point in his career, he was interested in sort of stretching the boundaries of what he could do and what he was perceived as, with Ryan's daughter. But also this is, as I mentioned, this is not a prototypical Robert Mitchum character. He is somebody who is desperate to make things happen so he doesn't have to go to jail.
And for his character not to survive the whole film was sort of unexpected for the lead actor in those days.
Right. And I think if you read the book, you knew what was coming. But I also think that brutality and the offhanded way in which it's unsensationalized way in which it's filmed appealed to him. Again, it has the feel of a modern day noir. It's not melodramatized, but it feels real in a way that, this movie for 1973 feels real in a way that Hollywood movies were not, even the new Hollywood movies didn't feel quite as raw and real as this one, which is maybe one reason that a lot of people didn't go to see it in the movie theaters. But I do want to say that I think Mitchum's performance is really quite wonderful because he conveys all the sort of angst that's eating at him, while at the same time maintaining this rough, tough, cool surface that he has to survive with these guys.
Thank you.
So I was wondering, just from a larger perspective, so Boston has this very distinct crime genre for films. And we did a series together on Boston films a couple of years ago. And it's true that like overwhelmingly the films that win Academy Awards out of Boston are part of this sort of crime genre.
Mhm.
Are there other cities in America that also have this distinct sort of crime genre? I mean, I think of like Philadelphia is like 3 times the size of Boston, but I can't think of anything in Philadelphia like this. New York is, you know, gigantic, but I think that there's Goodfellas and there's a couple sort of crime films in New York, but most of New York films aren't that. So I'm just wondering, is there anywhere, or is Boston crime central for America?
No, I think there are regional crime genres. I think New York, you know, is dominated by the Godfather sort of mentality of films, but there's a whole history of New York crime films. And in fact, Hollywood, when Hollywood tends to make crime films, often they're filmed in New York because that's where the big city is, especially after World War II, when you started doing location shooting. And you get movies like While the City Sleeps, and you know, things like that, where they're actually coming to New York and shooting and not shooting on a set. And that goes obviously into the you know, into the era of the French Connection and the 70s, and that realism really matters. And Serpico, and you know, anything with Al Pacino in it. And of course, Chicago has a rich history of crime. If you go back to the gangster movies, so the Warner Brothers gangster movies of the early 30s, those are either in New York or they are in Chicago, because that was the land of Al Capone. So anything, you know, anything with Cagney is going to be in New York or Chicago. And LA, I think LA Confidential is sort of a rare example of an LA crime film, and that has a real flavor of the place. And that sets it apart. It's not just a crime movie. And you could argue that Michael Mann's movies are also very much LA crime movies, and have a distinct flavor to them. So I don't think, you know, and there's somewhat one-offs, Miami Blues, I'm thinking of, you know, I don't know that there's, you know, is there a Houston gangster movie? Probably. I don't know about it. But yes, Boston is now sort of cemented to the point of stereotype, to the point of cliche, in large part because I think, and I'm speculating here, that there is such a vast gulf between the working class culture, the you know, the Irish immigrant culture of Boston, and the institutional culture, which is, you know, based in Puritanism and WASPs and Cabots and lodges and Harvard, and those two worlds are very distinct and entwined in ways that have always been in secret, that have always been, and you know, and that's a great subject for a movie. And there aren't many movies that get at that. The Verdict is one. I think The Verdict is one of my very favorite Boston films. I always say it's the Oscar that Paul Newman should have won. But it's easier to just have a bunch of colorful Southie mooks, you know, calling each other names and shooting each other, and that becomes cartoonish. And I think that, you know, I would love to see other Boston films being made, and in fact, there are other films plenty of films being shot here because of the tax breaks that filmmakers get. There's a whole history of why films weren't made in Boston for about 30 years, and it has to do with the Teamsters kneecapping people. But I am sort of glad that the Boston crime genre has sort of died down for a bit, so we might get some other kinds. But I also would like to see some richer, more thoughtful films set in that milieu. You know, you could argue that Manchester by the Sea takes some of those characters and puts them in a drama of some complexity. That, you know, if one thing is, these movies are sort of a slur on the Boston Irish, and it's like, you know, if you're going to make a movie about these people, they're going to be shooting each other and they're going to be criminal creeps. Well, no, that's by far the minority, obviously. So let's have some other stories.
Well, Peter typed into the chat. Can you talk a bit about the career of Peter Yates and where Eddie Coyle stands in it?
Yates is interesting. He's British. He's not Boston. He's very much British. Hold on, I'm just going to pull up his. I was just looking at his Wikipedia page, and he's got a really good filmography. He made Bullet. He made a his third feature film was a British film called The Robbery, about a heist film. I haven't seen it, and now I want to. And it was a sizable, low-level hit here, enough to bring him to Hollywood. And he got assigned Bullet, and of course the car chase scene in that is still legendary. Although you compare it to the Fast and the Furious, and it looks like they're driving around at 30 miles an hour. But by the standards of that day, nobody had ever seen anything like that. So all of a sudden, he can do crime films, he can do action scenes, he's in demand. After that, he did a bunch of different kinds of films. He made a film with Dustin Hoffman right after The Graduate called John and Mary, with Mia Farrow, that sank like a stone. And if you see it, you would know why. But he made The Hot Rock, another heist film with Robert Redford, sort of a beloved film of that era. And that after The Hot Rock, he made Friends of Eddie Coyle. He made The Deep, which we all remember for its poster and Jacqueline Bisset in a t-shirt. But he also made Breaking Away, which is a beloved movie set as far away from any city about young kids on a bicycle team, or even young townies racing their bicycles. If you haven't seen that movie, I really urge you to. He basically was a jack of all trades in both Britain and in America. He made Eyewitness, a thriller with a young William Hurt and Sigourney Weaver. So most of his career was in the late 70s and early 80s. He bounced back with a movie called The Dresser, starring what's his name? Albert Finney and Tom Courtenay, which won a bunch of Golden Globes and was nominated for Oscars. And then his career pretty much started winding down. And he did make films after that, but they're good, solid dramas and thrillers. And he passed away in 2011. He did record a commentary track for Friends of Eddie Coyle, I think 2 or 3 years before he died. And it's worth a listen if you get the DVD. He's quite chatty, and he tells wonderful stories about what it was like to make this film and how much he loved shooting here and just getting into the localism of the place. And he tells one great story about when they're trying to figure out how to, this is a spoiler alert for people who haven't seen the movie, but in the final scene when Eddie Coyle gets shot, and they were, how do you research something like that? How do you research a mob hit? And apparently there were a lot of Teamsters working on the film, and basically the movie is about these guys, because a lot of the Teamsters at that point were connected. And one of the drivers, one of the production drivers, the guy who drove the van, said, I've heard about some mob hits. I can give you some insights here. And so Yates sits him down, and the guy starts telling him about, this is how it might work. And you wouldn't do this, and you might do that. And he's given more and more detail, and he's getting more and more into the telling. And Yates finally figures out, this guy knows what he's talking about. This guy has done this. So that's how kind of close things were. But he's somebody who, if you listen to that commentary track, he's clearly somebody who just loved making movies and really enjoyed making this one for all the reasons that he should have. He knew it was not a Hollywood film. He knew that it was close to a realism that had never been sort of put on film before.
So we had a question from Allison, who said, was the city administration receptive to having this movie filmed in Boston? Obviously, it was a bit of a negative portrayal of the city.
Yeah. Boston, the city of Boston was not very keen on inviting filmmakers. My understanding, and I don't know the details of it, it's a good question, is that this film, they obviously got, and actually, yes, Yates does talk about, on the commentary track, about how the city gave him everything he wanted. But one of the things is they weren't shooting any place the city cared about. So yeah, you want to go shoot in the Boston Bowl? Sure, fine. You want to go shoot in an abandoned pier out by the Neponset? Go right ahead. But they did. They certainly, I don't think, were upset about it. I do know that. So 1968 was kind of a weird banner year for films being shot in Boston. There was the Thomas Crown Affair. There was the Boston Strangler. There was Charlie with Cliff Robertson winning an Oscar, which was set here. And there's a fourth, and I can't remember what it was. Certainly the Boston Strangler, the city fathers were not happy about that being made here. Elliot Richardson, who was then, I don't know what he was at that point, Attorney General, probably. I mean, no, he was Attorney General for the in the Nixon administration, but I forget what his role was in Boston at the time, but he was portrayed by an actor and he was really unhappy about that. He did not want that film to be made, and neither did Ed Brooke. He was also played by an actor in that, the senator. So, at that point, the city fathers did not want our dirty laundry to be aired by Tony Curtis playing Albert DeSalvo as the Boston Strangler. That movie's got some really great Boston accents in it. That's an interesting movie. But in general, Boston was a no-fly zone for film crews. For one thing, the city administration generally didn't make it easy for filmmakers. And for another, the Teamsters were run by the mob, and they shook film crews down. And if they didn't get what they wanted, they'd beat people up and they'd smash windshields. Somebody got beaten up on the set of the Cider House Rules pretty badly, sent to the hospital. And after a while, Hollywood says, the hell with that. We're not going to make a movie in Boston. Why are we going to do that? And that went on really until into the early 2000s, when a new head of the Teamsters came in and the Boston Film Commission started getting to, basically people got together and said, this has got to stop. We want film production to come back. Let's make some laws about tax breaks. Let's get the Teamsters to calm down. And they did. And now you have a really vibrant filmmaking local community of production people who work, whenever Hollywood or whoever comes to town. There are set dressers and production designers and costumers, and I know plenty of them. And it's great. And so now I think we're in a situation where, we're very open to films being made here, but wasn't always the case.
Well, Rose wrote in that on the Criterion DVD, Yates talks about Mitchum's intensity and his use of his eyes and face. Yates also talks about shooting at night and what that adds to the movies. There wasn't really a question in there, but I don't know if you want to talk about either of those things, about Mitchum's intensity or filming at night.
Well, filming at night is filming at night is always tough. How do you light it? How do you light it so it looks real, so it doesn't look like it's lit up like a ball field? I do know that Yates talks about his lighting designer and his grips and his electricians as this incredible team that were able to just move into these spaces that were sometimes really difficult to set up. There's a scene that takes place in a trailer where one of the characters is living. It's a scene with Mitchum and the guy and his girlfriend. So you've got three actors, and it's not a set. It's a trailer. It's like a big Winnebago. You got to get a camera in there. You got to get the lights in there. You got to set up for all these different shots. And it looks, as you're watching it, you're not thinking anything. You're not thinking that you're just watching the scene. But if you know anything about filmmaking, and Yates talks about this on the track, it's a very, very difficult thing to set up all these different shots with all that equipment in this tight space. The marvelous thing about the movie is that it looks as natural as it does, no matter when it takes place. I will say the only unnatural thing about Friends of Eddie Coyle is that they go from Boston to Quincy by way of the Callahan Tunnel in one scene, which is physically impossible. But I think they wanted I just love the fact that they have a scene in one of those old funky old tunnels. So they, what the hell, even if it's geographically impossible, let's throw it in. As far as Mitchum's subtlety goes, I mean, I won't say he's an underrated actor, because I think everybody rates him correctly now as a great actor, but he knew what people like Gary Cooper knew, and all the other great naturalistic actors of the movie, Spencer Tracy, who, people would act in scenes with them, standing next to them, and they'd yell cut, and they were like, what? This guy didn't do anything. This guy just stood there like a piece of sack of potatoes. And then they watched the rushes, and it's all there. It's all there. They somehow know. That's literally a story people told about Gary Cooper, that he's just somehow able to think his emotions onto the film. And Mitchum does that as well, in part because remaining cool is part of his brand, and was, and in a different way as in this film. But I do think that all the performances in this film are really, really great. But I always feel that you always feel a little performative edge to some of them, because they're actors, and I don't get that with Mitchum. He just is this character. He's and the character wants something and needs something, and sometimes he's acting, like in that scene we saw. But he's able to convey all these sort of cross currents of anxiety and toughness and paranoia and plotting, but with very, very minimalist gestures. He's a minimalist, like all great American actors are. He's a minimalist.
Well, sort of somewhat along that theme, Kathleen wrote, he said, Ty, you're getting some questions fielded about Robert Mitchum, the actor. For me, in most of his films, he straddles between good and evil. I cite A Hollywood Affair and The Night of the Hunter. And as you pointed out, he is the king of noir, or one of them. His character in Eddie Coyle seems more neutral, neither heinously bad nor virtuously good. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, it's interesting you point out those two movies. Holiday Affair, I haven't actually seen that until recently. I saw it a couple of months, I saw it around Christmas time. It's a Christmas movie with Janet Leigh. I think if it's not her first movie, it's one of her first movies. She looks like she's about 18. And Robert Mitchum playing a decent guy, who's working in the toy department of a department store. Which, I mean, is he gonna beat up the teddy bears? What's going to happen here? But no, it's a very sweet love story. She's a single mom, and it's a delightful film. And it's wonderful to see him play somebody in which he's still cool, he's still laconic, but he's a decent guy. And there's no darkness to him. There's a bit of an edge because that's who he is, but there's no darkness to him. But then you look at Night of the Hunter, which is one of the great American movies, and one of the great performances in American movies, as the evil preacher, singing "Leaning on the Everlasting," it's "Leaning on the Everlasting Arms," in this film directed by Charles Watton, the only film he directed. If you have not seen Night of the Hunter, I urge you to see it. It is a surreal classic, and getting its pants shot out by Lillian Gish. What kind of movie is this? But that movie, and in what's the movie where he plays the one that Scorsese remade? I'm blanking out on it. Where he plays Max Cady, the role that Robert De Niro played in the Scorsese remake. Cape Fear. Thank you. That is a figure of absolute evil. There aren't many people who can convey absolute evil in the movies. Robert Ryan, Dennis Hopper, Mitchum when he wants to, and he can play different kinds of evil. In Cape Fear, he is scary. In Night of the Hunter, it's almost comical. It's scary, but it's also there's a level of comedy to it that's very, very sly. So he could do just about anything. I would have loved to have seen him try Shakespeare. Who the hell knows what that would have been like?
Right. Well, Mark said, why recast Jackie Brown with a white actor and duck all the references to the Black Panthers? That was a great subtext in the book.
Well, Jackie Brown's a white character in the book, as far as I know. It's not specified, but there is a running conversation about that. He thinks that he's being contacted by somebody who wants machine guns, and he thinks that it's a black guy, and it's you know that they're going to be used by Black Panthers or radical activists. And it turns out in both the book and the movie that that's kind of a feint. And that the people who are actually buying them are young white left-wing radicals, and they're just sort of minor characters. One thing that's you don't get in the movie, you do get a little bit but it would have been interesting to see. Higgins was not shy about portraying the racism of these people, and the N-word is batted around here, there, and backwards. And in some of his other books, like Rat on Fire, in which some of the characters, like the people living in the apartment building, are black. The racism of the white characters is just absolutely palpable. And again, Higgins is writing the way these people talk and the way people feel, and you're left to make your own decisions about them, although it's not hard to. So I would say that that's more present in the novel, and it's kind of softened down in the movie, but it's there. But no, I don't think the character of Jackie Brown is in the book is black. I think all the major characters are white in that particular book.
So I think that since we've already mentioned the fact that Eddie Coyle gets shot, I wondered if you had any comments about the sort of inglorious death of him. I mean, it's very sort of notable that, you know, he goes to a hockey game, he's in a good mood, he falls asleep. It's not a dramatic end.
Right. He goes to a hockey game, and as in the book, I wasn't sure that this, I'd forgotten that this was in the book. The book was written in 1970, and Bobby Orr was already playing for the Bruins. So Bobby Orr is name checked in both the book and the movie, but Mitchum has this great line, Bobby, number 4, Bobby Orr, what a future he's got.
Greatest hockey player in the world. Number 4, Bobby Orr. Jeez, what a future he's got, huh?
And you know, Eddie Coyle has no future. He's got an hour to live when he says that. And yes, it is probably the least sensationalized, least glamorous mob hit because he's asleep. He doesn't even get a death speech. He's just drunk and asleep. And it's sad and it's ironic and it's, pardon my French, but that's what Higgins was writing too. And I think that's why people like Elmore Leonard and Quentin Tarantino and Robert Mitchum responded to the book, because it's so unglamorized that it feels like something closer to the truth in a way that does not flatter these people and does not glamorize these people, but makes them out to be the murderous creeps that they are. You know, it's not a pleasant end, and it's not meant to be. And it's not. There's nothing. This is one of the least Hollywood movies ever made. This is one of the things I like about it, and I think what a lot of people like about it.
Well, thank you very much. I think we should be conscious of everyone's time. We're coming up to the end of the hour, but I think it's a great film, and I really appreciated hearing all of your thoughts on it.
Yes, I as well. Thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you guys and hearing the questions. And thanks.
And thanks to everyone for joining us.
All right.